There's an issue that I've come across fairly regularly. I just wanted to get a statement down, get my thoughts down. Maybe it can help others if you encounter the same thing. A lot of times there is a issue between the beliefs of Christianity and the beliefs of, say, maybe atheism, secularism, naturalism, or someone else, and you're having this contention about what is actually true. And a lot of times, especially if science is involved, and I love science, nothing against science. Christians pioneered science. It was belief in God that paved the way for science to even happen. So, not hating on science, but a lot of times people will say, oh, well, what you believe is not true, cannot be true because the evidence clearly says, or the evidence shows that that is impossible, or science says, or according to science. And a lot of times people say this, and what they're not understanding is that evidence does not necessarily lead to a particular conclusion. And that science doesn't actually say anything. Evidence, whether scientific or legal evidence or whatever kind it is, requires someone to assemble that evidence into a meaningful explanation. So it's like having a puzzle. Every little piece of data, every fact, bit of information, every bit of evidence is like a piece of a puzzle. If you take a puzzle and you just dump it out on the table, what do you have? You just have a pile of pieces. You have to actually put it together to see what the picture is. Same thing with evidence. That's what you have to do. You have to take the evidence and put it together. A perfect example of this is case law, a trial. Right? There's evidence. The prosecution doesn't have its own evidence, and the defense have its own evidence. All the evidence is laid out on the table, and both sides have to make a case from the evidence that they both have. The funny thing is, I've often had skeptics, atheists tell me that my beliefs are doubting and denying science, and then they say, what about forensics? If your beliefs were true, then no one would ever be found guilty based on forensics. And I love when they bring this up, because forensics totally backs up my side. Because here's the deal. If you're looking at a trial, what does the science, the forensic information provide you? Ballistics tells you that the bullets match. Doesn't tell you who fired the gun. Doesn't tell you what it was doing there. Right? Doesn't tell you any of that. It just says, hey, these bullets match. Fingerprints, what does that tell you? This person's finger touched that spot at some time. Was he at the scene of the crime? Was he there at the time? What happened? How did this get there? Doesn't tell you. Just tells you there's a fingerprint. And on. DNA. What it does is the science behind forensics gives you raw data. But that raw data doesn't actually add up to anything. A lot of times it's easy for us to assume it does, because some of them make such easy, simple sense, right? Like a fingerprint. You see a fingerprint, it's a natural, normal, reasonable conclusion to say, hey, that person was there because their fingerprint's there. And that little step is not a big deal. But the difference between evidence and conclusion is vitally important to keep in mind whenever you get to bigger steps and bigger theories and bigger conclusions that involve multiple lines of evidence, because the more complicated, complex it gets and the more steps away from the actual raw data you get, the more room there is for error. And so it's no big deal to say, hey, the fingerprint means they were there. Yeah, we know that means they were there. But the evidence is not that they were there. The evidence is that there's a fingerprint. And so what we see going on in bigger cases, let's say, for instance, there's a case where you have a friend, girlfriend, boyfriend, or whatever, someone that you know ends up dead, and the case lined out is that there was no forced entry, and you have a key to their apartment. The weapon used was your gun, which you store over at their place because, I don't know, whatever reason. There's DNA evidence under their fingernails, which appears to be defensive wounds, and you have scratches because you got into a fight and they slapped you and left some marks. Someone saw you over there, y'all got into a fight, there's evidence of the fight, you have been placed at the scene, it was your weapon that did it. Just stack up all of this forensic evidence against you, but you're sitting over here going, I didn't do it. If you've ever seen Shawshank Redemption, right? He's sent to prison because all of the evidence stacked up and says he did this. Only he didn't do it. And just because a reasonable conclusion can be drawn does not mean the reasonable conclusion is true. And that right there, more than anything, should draw the line and show the distinction between evidence and the conclusions we reach based on the evidence. And so just because the evidence appears to be able to fit together a certain way to a reasonable conclusion does not mean the conclusion is true. Hey, it might be. We need to check that out. We need to make sure what we're looking at. We need to examine things. But those who want to say that the evidence clearly shows, you're denying the evidence, you're ignoring or dismissing evidence. No, actually we're not. Because the evidence does not necessarily mean what they say it does. They get to make their case, you get to make your case, and you have to decide yourself, what are you going to believe based on the evidence? Because you can have perfectly reasonable people draw completely different, reasonable conclusions from the exact same evidence. It happens every day in court across the country where from the same exact evidence, the prosecution spins one story, the defense spins another, and they both make sense. And a jury has to make sense of this and figure out which one they are going to believe and which one is most reasonable. And we do the same thing. We're constantly doing the same thing, whether it's with the Bible, with science, whatever it is. The evidence itself does not speak. Science itself doesn't say anything. We have to apply our reason, our rationality, and put a conclusion together. So if anyone wants to stand there as if they authoritatively have claim on the evidence and say, it clearly says, it doesn't. It just simply does not.